The Avrum Rosensweig Show. My name is Avrum Rosensweig, and I'm very delighted to be here. I thank each and every one of my viewers and my listeners for joining me today. We're going to have no doubt a fascinating show, and I will introduce our guest in a moment. Um, Before we do that, I would like to throw out to you something really interesting. I was speaking with my friend, Moish Zombik, who is the owner and operator of Milk and Honey. And he gave me two dinners for two to give away here on the podcast. If you've been at Milk and Honey, you know that their food is excellent. It's gotten better and better over the years. Beautiful ambiance, beautiful service. My question to you is, if you can name three guests that I've had since the basically the newest inception of this podcast, email me at avrum.rosensweig@gmail.com. Name three guests that I've had since the newest inception of my podcast at avrum.rosensweig@gmail.com. The first person to do so will win a dinner for two at Milk and Honey. I don't know what it's worth. We'll have to find that out. I'm sure you'll get appetizers, though. Also, I'd like to dedicate this show to all of our brothers and sisters in Israel and Eretz Yisrael, in particular the IDF, who are showing incredible courage and bravery as they fight the enemy. Of course, we have to mention the hostages, our Jewish hostages, our brothers and sisters, and we have to bring them home as soon as possible. I would also be remiss, I believe, if I did not mention the fathers and the mothers and the grandparents and all of the families of those who are fighting, of the hostages who are showing incredible bravery and courage. And of course, much of what we're doing here in the diaspora as a Jewish community, as a broad Jewish community, is important. It's beautiful. We'll talk about that during the show. So accolades to all of us as well. I want to launch right into our show today, which is live on Facebook. Welcome to all my Facebook viewers, as well as YouTube and other social media outlets. My guest today, I'd have to say that he holds the record for being really my most ubiquitous guest, if you will, someone who has interviewed me and I have interviewed him. And his name is Rabbi Daniel Korobkin. Welcome, Rabbi. How are you?
Thank you, Avrum. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm always so delighted when you agreed to do my interview because Rabbi Korobkin is the rabbi of one of the largest Orthodox synagogues really in the Western Hemisphere. I think they have 800 members, families in the shul itself. And I know that you're traveling back and forth between Toronto and Israel. You've been there twice since October 7th. Thank God you have a beautiful family of 10, a lovely wife. Your hands are full, shall we say. One of the things that you've done over the last 30 years is to translate a very compelling, mysterious, and special book, which is called The Kuzari. I have a copy here, and I will show it to you. Here we go. You're welcome to give away one, Rabbi, for a skill testing question.
I don't even know if I have any more.
I'm sure you have a box downstairs.
They're out of print. Yeah. But no, they just recently went back into print.
Okay. And the Kuzari, as we will talk about throughout most of the show, actually, it's a story which is also considered Torah. You don't find that very much, a dialogue between a king and a sage. Let me leave it at that for now because there's so much more to say about it. But I'd like to launch into our discussion, Rabbi. Once again, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You and I have talked a lot about what is happening since October 7th and how both Israel is responding and how the Jewish people are responding in the diaspora. We talked about it on our show last week. You were together with Michael Kegel and Menachem Foyer. It was a fascinating interview, a back and forth on trying to define why anti-Semitism exists, how Israel is fighting this war, what we need to do to bring home the hostages. We got great reviews, by the way, so well done to you. I guess my question this morning then, or this afternoon, is really how are the Jews of the diaspora responding to the war in Israel? What would you say?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. I think that overall, you're seeing a tremendous amount of resurgence of really Jews caring about what's going on in Israel. I think that, as we all know, the country was divided. The country of Israel was divided before October 7th. And this caused ripples of division within the Jewish world in the diaspora as well. That division disappeared within Israeli society, and I'm detecting that that division has disappeared as well in the diaspora communities. So anyone who had previously cared about Israel, regardless of whether they were a critic or in favor of what the government was doing, now everyone who was previously involved and interested in Israel is taking a very, very positive stand. And people are raising billions of dollars with a B in support of Israel, sending supplies and providing humanitarian aid and and traveling to Israel. And I think that's amazing. I think it's really, really spectacular. I also note, even within my own community, that there are varying degrees of support. There are some people who, every waking moment, when they wake up in the morning, they're checking the Israel news. When they go to bed at night, they're checking the Israel news. Many of our congregants have children or relatives who are in Israel, and this is very, very personal for them. And then there are other people who are more detached. And, for each his own. I think that there are some people who are detached because they can't cope with the stress. And so they will preoccupy themselves with other things. I do sometimes become sad, maybe even to the point of disappointment, when I see people still posting on their social media who are living in the diaspora about how they're taking a vacation or in Florida and posting what they just had in this upscale restaurant in Miami. To me, that seems like it's just tone deaf. When Jews in the diaspora are not devoting their focus in what the image that they wish to reflect about their existence, about life, and they're just talking about frivolous things, it's probably, I know, my own shortcoming, and I have to work on it because I don't like to be critical of my fellow Jews. But I just feel that sometimes people aren't getting it, that this is a time where we have to focus exclusively on the war effort in Israel and making sure that our brethren are safe.
Rabbi, in Israel, it's very clear that the population there is both mournful, both sad, but also, to use a Hebrew term, they live alot. They are living, and they are living life as much as they possibly can. We're seeing rikudim, we're seeing dances, we're singing. One of my great nieces just got engaged at L'chaim on the weekend, and their
Mazel tov.
parting. Yeah, thank you. Their parting was absolutely beautiful, and even though the chatan, the groom, is on his way back down to Gaza right now, the Jews in the diaspora are mourning as well. Rabbi, are they not? We are sad here. I find that many Jews are walking around with a cloud over their head. And when you ask them why, they'll tell you because of October 7th and afterwards. Don't we have the right to also have a bit of an exciting life?
I think we do. I think we do. But and I'll just illustrate. Last Motzei Shabbat, last night, we had a game night in the shul.
Mm-hmm.
And this coming Motzei Shabbat, we're going to have a jazz night in the shul.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why are we doing it? We're doing it precisely because people are walking around with a cloud. And people do need a healthy way of expressing joy and finding joyful things in life. I just feel that to project that as your image on social media, I think is a bit misplaced. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong, and as a matter of fact, it's actually very healthy to celebrate life in wherever you find yourself, because otherwise we would all have nervous breakdowns. I just don't get it sometimes when people seem to use that as their primary way of identifying themselves to the public. That's the part that I think sometimes bugs me a little bit.
I hear you. Well, I think one of the compelling things about what's happening in Israel since October 7th is that you're seeing Chayalim, soldiers, who do not adhere to Jewish law. They would be considered chilonim or secular. They're wearing tzitzit, right? And you see them wearing tefillin. And to me, that's absolutely fascinating. I'd like to know from you, what is that message that we should take out of it? And are Jews in generally, do you find adhering more so to Judaism since October 7th?
Okay, great. The prophet said, and we sing it in a song, Hinei yamim ba'im nu'um Hashem, v'hishlachti ra'av ba'aretz. Days are coming, says God, I will send a famine to the land. It will not be a famine for bread. It will not be a thirst for water. Ki im lishmoa et divrei Hashem. There will be a famine or a thirst to hear the word of God. And that's what we're living today, is that where Jews of every stripe, of every walk of life, are now using God in their everyday language. Chayalim with tattoos are wearing tzitzit, even without a kippah, because they feel it's a form of ammunition or form of protection to help them be successful. This is a resurgence of the fear of God and the observance of Judaism, because moments like this in Jewish history remind us all of what it means to be a Jew and what really is important about life and about who we are. Can I tell you that more and more people are observing mitzvot today? Perhaps that's true, but I honestly, I don't think, that for some people, the end goal is you have to be Shomer Shabbos. I don't think that that's the end goal. The end goal is that every person has a greater awareness of God in their life. And for a man, it means maybe putting on a pair of tefillin that he never put on before, like Chabad does, in their mivtzaim. And for a woman, maybe to be to take challah or to light Shabbat candles, as many of the women are. I was so touched by that video of a woman who was clearly not Orthodox religious, but she was told by her friends that if she should do the mitzvah of hafrashat challah, of taking some dough from the unbaked dough and through that mitzvah, good things would happen. And as she's taking the dough off of, this tithe of dough from the larger piece of dough, she gets a phone call that her child has been released as a hostage from Gaza. And to me, that was amazing. Can I say that it was the miracle and it was the merit of the taking of the challah? I'm not a prophet. I can't tell you that there's a direct correlation. But what I can tell you is that the fact that there was even a perception of a direct correlation means that our people, no matter how religious or not they are becoming more and more aware of this supernatural force in their lives, this metaphysical force in their lives, and this greater sense of purpose. And that's really a beautiful thing to behold, and we have to try and hold on to that as long as we can.
I know that you were very involved in interfaith work prior to October 7th. That basically means, that essentially means that you would meet with Christian leadership as well as Muslim leadership, and I'm assuming other denominational leadership. Last week on the show, you said, this has been very disappointing. And what you meant by that was that all the work that had gone into interfaith work with our Muslim counterparts and our Christian counterparts have not really stood up since the war started. You want to explain that further?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to distinguish between our Muslim counterparts and our Christian counterparts. There is a certain segment of the Christian community, the more, let's say, traditional or evangelical part of the Christian community, that is more committed to the Jewish people than ever before, and recognizes that this is not just a fight between Israel and Hamas, but it's a fight between good and evil. And they very, very clearly recognize that Israel represents the good and Hamas represents the evil. And as much as people have compassion over the Palestinians on the street who are suffering because of it, they recognize that Israel is fighting a moral and just war and has to win. So I want to be very clear on that. There are people even within our own community, among the Christian faith, that are very, very supportive. And I did get a couple of people reach out to me from outside of the Jewish community to express their sympathy, right after October 7th, and I was very grateful. From the Muslim community, it's quite interesting. If you remember the Tree of Life tragedy in Pittsburgh that happened maybe about 3-4 years ago. And I actually got a bouquet of flowers from an imam expressing his sympathy for what had happened. This same imam is now on a rampage against Israel in a very, very public way on his Instagram account, spewing forth all sorts of negative propaganda about Israel, about being guilty of genocide, and about all of its illegitimacy as occupying the land and committing all forms of atrocities throughout modern history against the defenseless Palestinians. And to me, it shows that there are two faces to the Muslim world. There is, or at least there was up until October 7th, a sincere desire to create relationships with the Jewish community of the diaspora, to find common ground and to see where we could work together and, share resources for security, work towards politically expedient goals that we share, and so forth and so on. Israel, however, was a subject that we spoke about in theory alone and agreed to disagree. Once October 7th happened, not even before Israel raised one rifle or one shot, one bullet in retaliation, there was an immediate condemnation of Israel, which is fascinating because this was not accusing Israel of genocide, but rather was defending Hamas's right to defend itself against colonialism by any means necessary, even if it meant the massacring of innocent civilians. Okay, and this has been the message that we've been getting. And among the Muslims that I did reach out to, I got absolute silence, radio silence. In other words, even people that I enjoyed a relationship with in the past, even the ones who are not prepared to be vocally against Israel, certainly have not been there to express sympathy and have not even responded to requests for contact. And so that to me says that we have a huge challenge ahead.
Well, what's your response once the war has died down? What will you do?
Don't know. I hope that, I can pass the baton to somebody else who maybe has not been as jaded as I have. And maybe it'll be some younger person. Maybe the next generation will be able to work on this with a younger generation of Muslim leaders. I think that the older Muslim guard, even the imams in the diaspora, have been so contaminated by anti-Israel rhetoric and propaganda that it's very, very difficult to surmount that. I can only hope that things will change. But I will tell you that I'm not terribly optimistic. And the reason is because Jews are outnumbered in Canada something like 7-1 from the Muslims. Muslims they're approaching 10% of the Canadian population, and Jews are either staying the same population that we were 50 years ago or are decreasing, which means that we represent a much smaller percentage of the population than we used to. And there's no incentive anymore for Muslims to engage with Jews because there's no utilitarian benefit or very little. As a Muslim friend said to me shortly before October 7th, before any of this happened, and we had a very friendly conversation, recognizing the political landscape of Canada today and how so many Muslims have actually learned how to maneuver the political system. He said, just look at the population differences and the demographics. He says the Jews are screwed. Those were his words. You guys are screwed. And I believe he was telling the truth.
I wonder, though, Rabbi, whether we are doing all of the correct work. Accolades to those rabbis, leaders who are involved in interfaith or work. But we all know that in times of peace, if you will, here in Canada, okay, where things have died down, it's not an intifada, it's not a war, that on the ground, our young people especially are not reaching out in droves with a clear vision of what to do with the Muslim community. We're not breaking bread with them. We're not. And we've seen vile placards at protests during the intifadas, Jewish children back to the war, back to the ovens. And then when things die down, well, we go back into our community and they go back into ours. So there are many, many programs within the Jewish community, in some ways, either directly or indirectly, sort of reaching out to the non-Jewish world. V'Hafta is a good example with our van, where we take out volunteers on a nightly basis to help out all peoples, not only Jews, but non-Jews in particular. And I always thought that was a Kiddush Hashem, a holy thing to do. I'm wondering, are we really doing the right things with our soldiers on the ground in times of peace? Are we really doing the right stuff and enough of it?
It's an interesting question. It's really a question of reflecting on the past and hoping for something better in the future, because there's nothing to do at the present. At the present, when Israel is at war, I don't see any avenue of communication right now. I think the channels are completely shut off. Can we, let's say, do some soul searching and say perhaps we didn't cultivate sufficiently a relationship with the Muslim community in Canada? I think there's truth to that, and maybe we have to do a little tshuva for that. Does it provide us with lessons for the future? Perhaps. But I would be, based on what I've seen since October 7th, over these last 120 days, I think that we have to be extremely cautious and understand never to forget what happened over this period of war. Just like Jews said, never again, and we will never forget after the Holocaust, we have to remember that there were people who were vocal supporters of the Jewish community, who were very much against genocide against Jews during the Shoah. And then but the vast majority of people were silent. And I'll just allowed the Nazis to plow through the Jewish population and do with it as it would. It's going to take a long time, and it may take many years for there to be a trust that develops again between the Jewish and Muslim communities.
So, Rabbi, with that, from your filter as a halachic Jew, do you believe that ultimately that we can find peace, that our neighbors, our enemies, if you will, can find peace with us? I know that there is a Rashi, a commentary on the Torah, that says Esav Sona et Yaakov. And there's all kinds of interpretations on it. One of them is inherent to creation, is the idea that the Jewish people will be hated for various different reasons. My question to you is there a possibility of worldwide peace with the Jewish people?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what the end game is supposed to be, that there's going to be peace throughout the land, and the Jewish people will emerge as a world power that will be unmolested and undisturbed and will be admired by the rest of the world. And that's where we are headed. But it's not a linear path. There are going to be a lot of bumps in the road and a lot of detours. And that's where we are right now. Listen, the same sages tell us that Yishmael, who is traditionally known as the progenitor of the Muslim people, did tshuva at the end of his life, and that's a portent for the fact that the Muslim world will eventually reconcile with the Jewish people, and in many aspects of the Christian world already have reconciled with the Jewish people, and many parts of what we would call Esav actually love Yaakov now, love the Jewish people now. So I believe, and look at the Abraham Accords, look at the fact that so many Arab states have made not only peace with the Jewish people, but are the greatest partners in commercial trade throughout the Middle East. Had Hamas not attacked on October 7th, we probably would have had a partnership with Saudi Arabia by now, or at least, it's something that we can look forward to. So, no, I would never give up on that image, on that messianic image that is slowly unfolding. We are in a rough spot now, but that should not make us so cynical that we don't foresee a greater future.
Who is that mindset which is watching this show right now and saying, Rabbi Korobkin, you're very naive? What sort of mindset is that?
I don't know. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. I think it would be naive. Someone would rightfully accuse me of naivete if I was going to say that tomorrow morning I'm going to be going over to the mosque and we're going to sing Kumbaya together and hug and kiss. That would be naive. I think I'm being very pragmatic, but at the same time, you also have to be optimistic about the future. And I don't know how long that's going to take. It may take years, but I do believe in the prophets, and I do believe in the end game of there being a world that is united in peace.
Okay, let's jump forward here.
Okay.
Way back in the 90s, you decided, based on your leadership at a synagogue in the States, that you needed a new philosophical document to teach, to learn, because you had learned some prior to that. So you looked around, and I guess together with your congregants at that time, you decided what you would pursue would be the Kuzari. Now, one of the challenges that you had in front of you was there wasn't a sufficient translation at that time which would allow you to learn in the way that you wanted to teach in the way that you wanted to. Someone had formatted the Kuzari based on ideas, but that wouldn't allow for the free flow of the story unfolding. So what my dear friend Rabbi Korobkin said about doing is writing a translation of the Kuzari. Because my very first question to you is, was your mindset at the time, I really want to write something?
It was so many years ago. So what I first can tell you is that it took a lot of chutzpah to do what I was going to do. Had I known the amount of work and the amount of really serious scholarship and research that would have to be invested into this, I probably would never have gotten started. But it really started in a very casual way. I mean, I was doing a lot of kiruv work in the earlier or outreach work, to Jews who were unaffiliated, and I always felt that the way to appeal to people who were interested in seeking Judaism is to provide them with Jewish ideas. And there's all different. Everyone has a different way of trying to reach out to their fellow Jew. My way of reaching out to my fellow Jew was by trying to appeal to the intellect and to try to make Judaism something that's rational and satisfying to the soul and to the mind. And so we had taken texts, classic texts that had been translated into English, and it was much more limited back in the 90s than what it is today. And I had always heard about this book called the Kuzari. I didn't know very much about it other than it was in dialogue form. It had been written in the 12th century, and that it was really a classic, and it was essential for a Jew to understand, the basics of what we Jews believe and the basis of our faith. But I didn't really know too much about it. I also was able to get a hold of a translation that had been published by Schocken Books, which is a subsidiary of Random House, that had been reprinted many times since it was first published in 1905 by a German scholar named Hartwig Hirschfeld, who translated it from the original Arabic. And I thought, great, just like I have a copy of Derech Hashem, The Way of God in Hebrew and English, I can get Da'at Tevunot, another book by Luzzatto, translated into English. Now I have the classic Kuzari in English. Problem was, when I started to teach it, I realized that the English was so archaic and so difficult to get through that it really wasn't working. And so I had to drop the project after a while. And I said, like we say in Talmudic parlance, I ayasher cheli. If I ever get the ability to do something meaningful and I have the time to do it, I'd love to offer a new translation to the public. So fast forward a couple of years, my wife and I moved to a small Jewish community in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is like a one shul town. And all of a sudden, there was something in the 90s called the Jewish Book Club. I don't know if it came to Canada or not, but it was like this monthly circular that offered books published. Most of the books were published under the publisher's cover of Jason Aronson. That was the name of the publisher. And their marketing plan was to sell their books through using a Book of the Month club. And I noticed that the return address was a P.O. box from Allentown, Pennsylvania, of all places, this small little shtetl where my wife and my family were living.
Yes.
So I figured out, let me call the editor, introduce myself. I've never heard of you guys. I don't know where your office is, but if you're anywhere near Allentown, I'd love to meet you. And so I finally get a phone number. I call the guy. It was a guy named Arthur Kurzweil. And he told me,
Yes.
no, we just have a PO box in Allentown. Our offices are in Spring Valley, New York.
Right.
And I said, so we schmoozed for a couple of minutes, and then the last thing Arthur said to me, he says, "Oh, and by the way, we're always looking for new material. If you'd ever like to publish something, let me know." And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I've been toying with this idea of the Kuzari, yada yada yada." And he says, "Well, that's a great idea. When do you think you can get me a manuscript?" And so I went to work on it, and thank God, Allentown in many ways is the same kind of climate as Toronto. And so there was one particular winter where there was a huge snowstorm. We were holed up for several weeks. And I just, as a younger man, you sometimes have the ability just to plow through things. And that's what I did. And it took about 2.5 years, and I finally got him a translation. I didn't know Arabic at the time. Subsequent to that, I had gone back to school and studied Arabic, because the original text of the Kuzari is not in Hebrew, but rather in Judeo-Arabic. It was later translated about 30 years after it was first published in 1140. In the year 1167, it was translated into Hebrew by the very famous Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibon, who was a master translator. So I used that translation, I used the commentaries, and I came up with the translation. The Kuzari started selling, and everything was fine. But I wasn't really satisfied with the distribution. It wasn't getting the kind of distribution that I was hoping for. So when several years later, about 10 years later, when Jason Aronson decided to sell their company to a print-on-demand operation, they gave every author the opportunity to hold back their copyright and to shop their book to somebody else. And with the advice of my father of blessed memory, who was a copyright lawyer and was in the entertainment business, he advised me very wisely to hold back the copyright. And don't worry, he said, you'll find someone else to publish it. I shopped it to the two major book publishers at the time, ArtScroll and Feldheim. Surprisingly, ArtScroll held on to it for quite a long time, and they finally decided that they would pass.
Yes.
And you know why they decided to pass? It had nothing to do with me. They said the Kuzari has too much philosophy in it, and it's not going to pass muster with our rabbinic leadership, who feel that it might be too controversial and may not be getting across the right message. To me, that's fascinating, because here you're dealing with a Jewish classic from the 12th century that was written to strengthen the faith of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's people, the Jewish people, who were floundering in their emunah, in their basic ideas of faith. And now you have a 21st century, very, very religious publisher who says we have to pass on this, because even though it's meant to strengthen people's faith, but it also exposes people to some Greek philosophical ideas, which may get them confused, and we're going to have to pass. Feldheim, to their credit, saw the value in this kind of work, translating it from A to Z and making sure that it was preserved in its original form with appendices and explanations and all kinds of supplementary materials. And therefore Feldheim picked it up, and it's been in print since 2009 in its second edition, in the Feldheim edition.
And you now have a second print that came out this past summer.
And this past summer we did a revision. It's not even a complete revision; it's a partial revision, and I wrote a translator's preface to the second edition, and that just came out this past summer 2023.
So the philosophical piece that you referred to, having to do with ArtScroll, and I think ArtScroll in its beginning days was highly anti-philosophical. I think it was set up for the basic simple mind, if you will. It's changed somewhat, but I understand why their response was that at that time. But my point is, let's dive into the Sefer. So is it called a Sefer? Is it Torah? Is the Kuzari Torah?
Absolutely.
It is Torah.
Absolutely.
What is Torah? How do you define
Absolutely.
Torah?
Torah is any kind of literary work that helps you understand better the the way of life that God instructed to us at Mount Sinai.
So if I write a book on Sefer Bereshit, on the book of Genesis, is that Torah?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. You're writing a commentary on the
W-
Torah. That is
within
itself, that is
parameters,
itself.
right? Within parameters.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
what would those parameters be?
I mean, our sages do talk about a person who is megale panim shel Torah shelo kahalacha. That if a person's interpretation of Torah is so far afield from what's accepted to be within a certain margin of normalcy, right? So that he starts interpreting texts in completely wild ways that really are outside the pale of anything that our sages felt was legitimate. So then that's not Torah anymore. That could be heretical. But it's very hard to, I think in today's world, it's really hard to meet that criteria.
Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, he lived, I think it was 1070 till around 1140. Is that pretty accurate?
1060 something until 1140.
He was a philosopher. He was a doctor, and he was an author. He was a writer, clearly, and he was
more important than that. He was a poet.
He was a poet.
He was a romantic.
He was a romantic, wasn't he?
Absolutely, absolutely.
He wrote 800 poems, and he's considered to be the most formidable poet, perhaps, in the history of the Jewish people. I'll read a stanza to you that he wrote at that time. Remember, you're talking 1,000 years ago. Do you see over my shoulder falling, snake-like ringlets waving free? Have no fear, for they are twisted to allure you unto me. This was a frum Jew. And when I said to you, Rabbi, in our discussion prior to the interview, wow, his poetry blew me away. He said, yeah, he wasn't a yeshiva guy, was he?
Yeah, that's what I said. He wasn't. Yeah, he wasn't that. No, I said he wasn't yeshivish.
He wasn't yeshivish. That's correct. Yes,
he wasn't yeshivish. What I meant by that is when you look at some of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's poetry, you see that there's a part of him that, you know, probably if he was living today, he'd be into rock and roll, or you know, or
the Grateful Dead or something. Yeah.
Yes, something like that. That's what. Now, there are people, first of all, there are many people who are just ignorant. And I remember a rabbi once telling me, because I had actually written about this, that he wrote love poetry and he was a romantic, that you're mevaza talmidei chachamim, you're disgracing the Torah scholars. And I said, what are you talking about, Rebbe? I said, are you aware of his poetry? Do you understand the corpus of what he wrote? That there were some poems that he wrote that were secular in nature, that were love poems to a beautiful woman, and that he talked about wine and other things like that. And he was totally ignorant, and he later apologized to me. But I think what can be perhaps suggested is that just like any other human being, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi went through different chapters of evolution in his life. He probably wrote those sections of poetry that are dedicated to women and wine and song, probably at an earlier stage in his life when he was a little bit more on the wild side. And then as he became more mature and he evolved as a great Torah scholar, he was able to, you know, to focus more on, take that love and that passion in his life and focus it more on his love for Zion and his love for Torah and his love for God. And that's, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's, you know, but to say that he was from day one of his maturity to today, to the last day of his life, he was monolithic in the same person. That's not true.
Well, that's fair enough. But I mean, the inevitable question is King David, again, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, they both wrote what could be construed as eros, at least in part, right? But yet,
well, if you're referring to King Solomon's Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs,
King Solomon's Shir HaShirim, yes,
yeah, you could.
So is that included in the corpus of Torah?
I don't know that you can necessarily say that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's poetry about a woman's beautiful lips are part of Torah. I don't think that you don't have to say that, because his work was never canonized.
What about Shir HaShirim?
So Shir HaShirim was canonized, and it was acknowledged by our sages as being a metaphor for the relationship between God and Israel. I don't think that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was necessarily thinking about God when he wrote his early poetry. And that's just who he was, you know, and it's out there, you know, so there's not, you know, and the fact of the matter is that people do evolve, people mature, and people realize what's really the important things in life. And instead of, today, when a person's a Baal Tshuva, they can't wait to hide their past. Like, God forbid people should know that I used to listen to secular music. Oh, yeah, Shander. And well, it's going to harm my shidduchim for my children, right? But the fact of the matter is, and I tell this to people, I said, look, I grew up with secular music because my father was an entertainment lawyer in the music business. There was a period of time when I shunned it and I didn't want anyone to know about it. And I came to the realization, you know what? I love that period of music in my life. It was in the 70s, and I get inspired by it. I get uplifted by it. And the fact is, it's part of who I am. So instead of sort of, hiding it, I say, okay, so there's beautiful music, beautiful lyrics from certain artists in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s that I'm very, very fond of. And if I can weave it sometimes into a drasha or into a Devar Torah, that's even better, because a person is, if you believe in God and you believe that he's guiding the trajectory of your life, so then you also believe that the experiences and encounters that you've had with different people can always be used in a positive way.
You are our gift, Rabbi. You are our gift.
Oh, stop it. Okay, next.
You're also very humble, by the way. Do you write poetry yourself?
Not yet. No,
Not yet.
No. I think I have it in me, but I'm not there yet.
I challenge you to write a piece of poetry to your wife. You don't have to share it with us, or bring flowers. That's nice too. So Rabbi Yehuda Levi lived at this time where Greek philosophy was ubiquitous, where it was strong, where it was powerful, and to study Aristotle or Socrates or Plato, you realize that there is a lot within it that is reasonable. To the extent that the Rambam actually used a lot of Greek philosophy in terms of the development of his own thought. Rabbi Yehuda Levi got very, very scared. He got very, very concerned about the influence of Greek philosophy within the Jewish world. As an example, the whole idea of God's providence, that he is involved in our day-to-day, that God created the world, that was anathema to Greek philosophy. So Rabbi Yehuda Levi set about writing about this in a storytelling way. Give us a little bit of the history of that, the Kuzari.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so remind me that we need to come back to Maimonides, because in any discussion of medieval Jewish thought, you have to incorporate the Rambam, Maimonides, into this discussion. And the approaches of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Rambam could not be more different, according to many of the scholars. Right. So we'll get back to that in a second. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is a poet. He's an artist. And as such, he wants to be able to present the ideas of what Jews believe, not just in tome form. We believe, number one, we believe in God. Number two, we believe that God is all-knowing. Number three, that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wanted to engage his public. He understood that he was dealing with a population of Jews of his time who were getting distracted away from Judaism because of the allure of Greek philosophy, because the allure of Islam, because the allure of Christianity, because the allure of what was going on in the saloons and in art and in sculpture and in everything that in music, everything that was going on around his world. And so he decided, let me write a story that will grab the hearts and minds of my fellow Jews. And he wrote it with the title called the Kuzari, which means the leader of the Khazars. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was using basically a device, a literary device, which some people call the Socratic method, where he created an artificial dialogue between a pagan king of the Khazar people and a rabbi. And he sets up this whole device, this whole story, as one day there was a king in a faraway kingdom called the Kingdom of the Khazars. And the king he was a righteous man, and he wanted to connect with his creator. But he kept having a recurring dream every time he tried to do the right thing, where an angel came to him in a dream and said to him, your intentions are desirable to the creator, but not your deeds.
Not your deeds, yeah.
And the more he would go to the shrines and the more that he would offer incense and sacrifices, the more the angel came to him in this recurring dream saying, no, your intentions are desirable, but not your deeds. And this led the king to seek out different world religions and ways of life in hope of trying to find the true way of serving God. And eventually, he calls in, according to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's version of the story, he calls in a Greek philosopher who's very, very big in those times. And he calls in a Christian cleric, he calls in a Qadi, an Islamic judge, and he calls in a Jew. And he interviews the Jew last because he figures the Jew has certainly nothing to offer. Look at the Jews' condition today. They're downtrodden people. They probably have no intelligence left after having been thrown around throughout the diaspora for centuries.
He said they're small. They haven't grown.
They're small. They haven't grown. They haven't had much influence, and they've been, wandering Jews for centuries. They probably have no wisdom left. But it turns out he goes through systematically the Greek philosopher, the Christian cleric, the Qadi, and then eventually says, okay, let me try out the Jew. I'm not really getting the answer to my quest from the other people, so I might as well try out the Jew. And that's how Rabbi Yehuda Halevi opens the book. Now, was this pure fiction? Was this not based on anything? No. We know for a fact that in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's time, circulating throughout the world, there was a legend of the Khazar people who had converted to Judaism. And this is one of the appendices in the back of the Feldheim edition, where we talk about the historicity of the Khazars. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Jews of his generation were aware that there was contact made a couple of centuries before Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lived in the 10th century between a Jewish leader named Chazdai ibn Shaprut and the king of the Khazars called King Joseph. And they had corresponded back and forth. And Chazdai ibn Shaprut had asked the king, we hear that there's this nation of Jews in some faraway place. Like, are you one of the 10 lost tribes? And can we connect with you? And do you have any information that we may have lost over the centuries about when the Messiah is coming, or anything else that we may have lost in our Misorah or in our tradition? And the letter comes back, and these are called the Chazdai letters, because there is actually a document called the Chazdai letters, which we translated also in the Feldheim edition of the Kuzari, where the King Joseph comes back and says, no, our religion started about 300-400 years ago. We were originally pagans, and eventually we became Jews, describing a very similar kind of king named Bulan, who was searching for truth and eventually stumbled upon Judaism. Now, if you read some of the historians of the Khazars, they will tell you, yes, was there a Jewish presence in ancient Khazaria, like in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries? Yes, there was. And there are a number of books that have been written about the Khazars. As a matter of fact, Michael Chabon, who's a very famous Jewish author, I'm not such a big fan after I read some of his politics, but he writes beautifully. One of the books that he wrote is called Gentlemen of the Road, where he writes a fictional story, an account of some Khazar Jews and the wars that they had before the Khazar Empire was finally felled after a few hundred years. So that's the historical basis for this historical fiction that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi used as his device to create this dialogue between the Khazar king and the rabbi.
There are three approaches that you mentioned in your book that are taken in terms of the book itself, the Kuzari, as to whether, whether indeed that nation did exist. And there's a school of thought that says, yes, absolutely. And there's evidence that way. There are those who say, no, it's kind of like you said, historical fiction. And then there are others say, no, it didn't exist at all. The Rambam never wrote about Kuzari and the Jewish community there, did he?
No, he had no reason to. He was a codifier of Jewish law and a philosopher to write about a group of people who who existed in some very far away place. He was not a historian. That was not his role.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. I heard an argument made that absolutely that there was not a Jewish community there, because if there were, they would have gone and raised funds from them.
Yeah.
And there was no evidence that way, in any of the archives. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, he writes this book, and he writes it. The format basically is 5 different essays, right? And the very first essay is an essay where there is a discussion surrounding what you just mentioned. It's the king having these dreams, bringing in all these three religions and a Greek philosopher. And it's a lot of discussion ultimately around Judaism and Judaism throughout history. The second essay, the king actually converts, right? And because of that, much or if not all of his nation converts. Walk us past through that a little bit, the conversion part.
Well, it's not a major part of the book. It's just at the very beginning of the second essay. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi writes that after hearing the arguments of the rabbi that I've just presented to you in the first part of the book, the first essay, the king became very convinced, and so he went to a place called the Warsan Mountains, which is a mountain range in ancient Khazaria, which is a geographic location that we know where it is. It's between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. It's where the Warsan Mountains are, the Caucasus, and it's a mountainous region on the southern, just south of the Ukraine, above Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan. And that's where the Khazars lived. And they were a historically noted nation of people who lived in the medieval world. We know that. That's historically documented. There's also historical artifacts that there was a Jewish presence there. How widespread it was, we don't know. And I would, there's a very good book written by a friend of mine named Kevin Brook, who actually wrote some of the introductory material to the Feldheim Kuzari, where he goes through the history of the Khazars and some of the latest discoveries. And there's every year there's new material published about the Khazars.
Then the essays continue, and essentially Rabbi Yehuda Levi bears down, and he starts talking about the various different aspects of Judaism that are important, refutations to philosophy. There was also much in there about the Karaites, sort of arguing that the Karaites' approach to Judaism was incorrect. It wasn't rabbinic at all in nature. It was according to the letter of the law. Some people say that Rabbi Yehuda Levi, and tell me if I'm correct here, actually wrote the book because he had a student who turned into a Karaite. Is that correct?
It could be. That's one of the theories. Listen, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was trying to defend traditional Judaism,
yeah, which has happened throughout history, right?
Yeah. And there were two threats to traditional Judaism: one threat from the outside and one threat from the inside. So he in four out of the five essays, he really focuses on the threats from the outside, and in the middle essay, the third essay, he focuses on the threat from the inside, which is the Karaite denial of what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition. It's quite interesting. The structure of the Kuzari is the subject of much discussion because it's a little bit hard to figure out sometimes. Why, Rabbi Yehuda Levi weaves in and out of conversations. It's almost in that respect, even structurally, it's the opposite of the way the Rambam would write, which is a very structured, disciplined way. And Rabbi Yehuda Levi, as a poet and an artist, is weaving in and out like a stream of consciousness of ideas. There's a scholar who is named Yochanan Silman, who wrote a book about the history of the Kuzari. He says his theory is, and he's got all of the material to back himself up, is that it was written over the period of 20 years. And he thinks that the third essay was actually written first, and then, as an independent work, and then was incorporated within the larger Kuzari afterwards and made part of the third, and inserted as the third essay.
I think one of the fundamental things that we can take away from the Kuzari, and you wanted me to bring you back to the Rambam, so I'm going to do that, is the idea that the Kuzari was essentially saying that Judaism is an experiential religion, way of life, and not as philosophical or rational as the Rambam would say that it is. Explain to us that argument.
Yeah, there's one way of presenting the yin and the yang of Rambam and Yehuda Halevi is that the Rambam was the rationalist and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is the anti-rationalist. That doesn't mean to say that he professes that Judaism is irrational. He just feels that rationality, qua rationality, only gets you so far in your ability to connect with God. For the Rambam, ultimate connection with God is through the mind, is through the intellect. As a matter of fact, I'm actually teaching Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed right now online. And we're in a section of the book where he says probably the most, I guess, dramatic and controversial thing that exists in the guide, which is the whole objective of God giving us bodily commandments is to help us perfect our minds, because the only thing that remains of us after we die, that which is immortal about the human being, is our
Yes.
intellect, and because the body will pass away. So what is immortality? Immortality is a perfected intellect. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi did not believe in that, did not subscribe in that ideology whatsoever. He felt that the mind is actually a limited tool of the human being, and there's something that stirs within the soul which far transcends the intellect. And it's almost like, just to give you an example from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's own writings that'll help you appreciate this. He said, he asks the question, why is it that when you read a passage from Isaiah or Jeremiah, for example, the verses are somewhat simplistic, and when you compare that to something written by a great poet, it seems that the poet's writings or the philosopher's writings are so much more sophisticated
Right.
than the prophets. Right. Doesn't that indicate that the truth lies with the greater level of sophistication and profundity? And his response is no. That's looking at it from a purely intellectual standpoint. He says the fact that the prophets received words from God himself means that there's something in the words of the prophets that can connect on a metaphysical level with the soul of every reader that far transcends the intellect. Like I give this analogy. Do you remember the movie from the 80s called Amadeus?
Sure, yeah, I remember that movie.
Right.
It's a great movie.
So it was like this competition between Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and this court darling named Salieri, yes, who was older than Mozart. And Salieri was a musicologist, like a real professional who understood what music was about and how to compose music and knew exactly what the crowds were looking for. And then comes along this brash, undisciplined and unrefined young man, this ruffian named Mozart. And he doesn't even know how to explain where his music comes from. But when people hear the music, they know that that is something that resonates with their souls and is so uplifting that they're all drawn to Mozart. Whereas Salieri, the great intellectual musicologist, he can explain to you what chords are all about, the science of, how to create rising chords and lowering chords and how everything meshes together. But he's too dull, and he doesn't really have that point of inspiration, that indescribable, ineffable metaphysical quality of making his music special. And that is the way Rabbi Yehuda Halevi sort of describes the difference between a prophet and a philosopher. Interestingly enough, a 19th century philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard wrote a very interesting essay that underscores the very same idea. But he calls it the difference between an apostle and a scholar, but it's the same idea that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had written hundreds of years before. The point, however, is that when you look at the difference between the divide between the Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, both were dealing with the outside challenge of Greek philosophy, which had become so pervasive. It was the backdrop of all human thought in the medieval world, especially where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Rambam were living, which is the Islamic world. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is in Spain, the Rambam is in Fustat in Egypt, but they're under the same cultural milieu of Islamic philosophy, which is based on Greek philosophy. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's approach to it was to say, don't adulterate traditional Jewish thought with this foreign principle of Greek philosophy in the same way that the Muslims have done. That's not the right way to go. You're actually dumbing down and cheapening Judaism if you do that. The Rambam's approach was to say just the opposite. The Greek philosophy of our time is really just a repackaging of ancient wisdom that we've lost over the centuries. And our project, the Rambam said, is to recapture and bring back the Greek philosophy, which is really ancient philosophy of the Torah, and just reincorporate it, resynthesize it with this Torah that we recognize of today.
Now, does that debate still exist today? I know that the Rambam was ostracized after he died. Indeed, his many of his books were burnt. But I understand that in the yeshiva world, as an example, that the Rambam is completely accepted as documents, as books to study and to learn. Correct?
Oh, absolutely. But the yeshiva world is very selective of what they will study of the Rambam. The Rambam's Mishneh Torah, which is a codification of Jewish law, is universally accepted. Not so much so that certain yeshivot emphasize the Rambam over all of the other medieval commentators to the Talmud, because he was known as the Nesher Hagadol, the great eagle, the true master of all of Torah, both the written Torah and the oral Torah. But what people sometimes forget is that the first 4 chapters of the Mishneh Torah are based on Aristotelian science and are not based purely on traditional Jewish sources. And that's where, when the writings of the Rambam were first banned, the writings that were banned were not only the Guide for the Perplexed, which was considered to be way too philosophical and was going to lead Jews astray, but also the first 4 chapters of the Mishneh Torah. You can study all of the Mishneh Torah except the first 4 chapters. Everything else is fair game.
Have you studied it?
Sure, it's absolutely necessary to study if you want to be able to understand the Rambam's worldview, his philosophical worldview. Let me just make a very important point, and that is this: I am not interested in leading any Jew who's not ready for the truth astray. And that, what I mean to say is, to quote that famous Jack Nicholson line, sometimes you can't handle the truth. And I tell this to my kids also, who are at different stages of their evolution of Torah study. I don't want any young man or young woman in high school studying the Guide for the Perplexed. You're just not ready yet. There are certain aspects of Jewish thought that are more advanced topics. And if the worst thing that you can do, it's just like studying Kabbalah before you've mastered the exposed aspects of Torah thought. If you study advanced topics before you've mastered the preliminary ideas, you're going to end up with messed up thoughts, and you're not really going to understand Judaism properly, and you may end up just tossing the whole thing out of frustration. So what I would advise any person who's interested in this kind of study is know where you are on your spectrum of growth. And when you're ready to sort of put your big toe into the deep end, one of the areas of study that you may want to consider is the Guide for the Perplexed, but you have to be ready for it. You have to have studied the revealed parts of the Torah, like the Rambam himself writes at the end of the 4th chapter of the Mishneh Torah and the Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. He says, listen, the reason why I put these Aristotelian ideas at the beginning is because they're the most important parts of the Torah. But you can't start really studying them in any great depth until you've studied the Gemara about Abaya and Rava arguing about who's responsible for damages when a cow gets gored by someone else's ox. You got to master those parts first, and then when you've got those things under your belt, so to speak, then you can come back and really delve into the more philosophical aspects of Torah.
Rabbi, faith is a hugely discussed topic amongst us Jews. I think to some extent it's misunderstood. I myself grapple with it extensively. I'm sure that you do. Not a simple thing. Rabbi Yehuda Alevi views the need to satisfy the intellect as a concession to one who would not be satisfied by the simple. Is having faith a simple task? Is that what he's saying?
Well, I think Rabbi Yehuda Alevi, more than the Rambam, was a believer in simple faith. And the reason is because Rabbi Yehuda Halevi did not believe that the intellect was the key to closeness to Hashem, but rather righteousness of deed and piety, and things like prayer and things like goodness of spirit, and the performance of the commandments. I think for him, a Jew who embraces traditional Judaism without a need to work it through intellectually is the highest level of tzaddik for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. But for Maimonides, it's not that way. For Maimonides, a Jew could live his entire life going to Shachris Mincha and Ma'ariv every day, learning 2 hours a day after work and before work, and doing all the things that he's supposed to do, getting the most expensive lulav and esrog, and doing Shabbos every single Sabbath, and all these other things that he's supposed to do, living a life of Jewish righteousness. But if he hasn't developed his intellect, Maimonides says, nebach, too bad, but he's never going to achieve immortality in the world to come. Very, very different approach from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari have been so embraced, especially by the Hasidic movement that started under the Baal Shem Tov in the 18th century. It was precisely because Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was counter-intellectual in his approach to Judaism. So,
counter-intellectual, I mean, that's a powerful phrase. Was he against erudition? Was he against the development of the mind?
No, he wasn't against it at all. He just felt that that's not the major focus of how you become close to God. A prophet is not necessarily a genius. Yeah. A prophet is a tzaddik, a righteous man, a pious man. And that's really more important than how much intelligence you have and how developed your intellect is about your knowledge of the sciences. For the Rambam, it's just the opposite.
Rabbi, in conclusion, I want to ask you, is the Kuzari something that a person, because it's in a storytelling form, is it something a person can pick up and read, or should one have a teacher?
Well, Avrum, why don't you tell me? You've got the book.
Yeah.
How have you found it so far?
So thank you for asking. I would tell you as follows. It requires a lot of thought. And I think because my Torah learning has been pretty extensive the last few years, that a lot of the topics or ideas that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi refers to are really within my wheelhouse of understanding at this point. But I would say generally the best way to learn is with a chavruta or is with a teacher. And because that way you can give over your thoughts, you can hear another person's thoughts, you can share ideas. To me, a chavruta is it's really it's a soulmate of the intellect, and so there's something very valuable there. That's my thought on it.
I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right. Look, I've been teaching the Kuzari for the last 20 years to various different groups. I do a weekly class on Kuzari and Parsha every Tuesday morning. And we've been doing it for the last 12 years. And we're now in the middle of the 4th out of the 5 essays. Oh, wow. There are parts of the Kuzari that are more abstruse and more difficult to grasp. And then there are parts that are much more easy to grasp. And I would suggest that if you're really looking to study the work carefully, find someone who's somewhat familiar with the text, can guide you through, can help you maneuver through the parts that are a little bit arcane, and maybe would recommend that you maybe skip certain parts of it. But it's a very, very worthwhile and satisfying project.
Have you strengthened yourself as a Jew through your learning of the Kuzari?
Unquestionably so. Unquestionably so. It's also liberated me in the sense that, I look at someone like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who seems not to fit into the mold of what we define as a frum Jew today. And it makes me realize that frum Jews come in all stripes and colors.
Yeah, and have so throughout history, right?
Have so throughout history.
Yeah, the frum Jew today is not necessarily the frum Jew of the 12th century.
That's absolutely correct.
Right. Well, I want to thank you very much for doing this interview. It was fascinating. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on and letting a new set of people discover the Kuzari all over again. I mean, for me, it's old hat, but I'm always happy to discuss it. I think that there's so much wisdom contained in it, and I hope people pick it up.
Absolutely. I'm sure that they will. And I thank you for the translation of it as well. I want to thank my listeners and my viewers for coming out to the 13th show of the Avrum Rosensweig show. We really appreciate you doing so. And by the way, if you can let me know who were three of my guests since the launch of the new Avrum Rosensweig show, then you might just win a dinner for two at Milk and Honey. You can do so by sending it to avrum.rosensweig@gmail.com. I really want to send out a wish, some of my energy to our community here in Toronto, across Canada, in the diaspora, and to Israel. Oseh shalom b'mamav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. That we should have peace in our world, and that very, very soon, as the rabbi was saying, as Rav Yehuda Halevi was saying, that we can truly be a light unto the nation so far as the people recognize the beauty of our people. Outside today at Shepherd and Bathurst, my dear friend Giddy Mammon was leading a lot of people out there with Israeli flags, shouting out, and I could hear it clearly in my apartment while I was preparing for the interview. If you believe in peace, honk your horn. If you love Israel and the IDF, right, honk your horn. And there was a lot of honking and there was a lot of participation. He does this every Sunday, and he's done so for 15 weeks. So kol hakavod to him. Yeah, it's very good, isn't it? Come out. Absolutely. I think he does it from 11 till 1 or 12 to 2. It's online. And with that, I'd just like to conclude by saying, Am Yisrael Chai, that the nation of Israel lives, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you so much for joining.